Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ernie Bauer. I'm the chair for Southeast Asia Studies here at CSIS. It's a wonderful day where we have a great audience with us, and I'm really pleased to have Ben Rhodes. He's the assistant to the president and the deputy national security advisor. In that role, he is in charge of global outreach, and he has been taking the lead on Burma policy in the White House for the president. In that role, he's been to Burma, and I'm going to use Burma for this presentation in deference to, I guess you guys are saying Burma when you're in the United States.
We say both, yeah.
You heard it from the horse's mouth there, folks. You can use either, so I might slip between both. But he has been to Burma 4 times, twice with the president, and most recently in mid-October, I think October 18th to 20th. We asked Ben if he would come over and tell us a little bit about what he saw there, how he sees the election shaping up. The election's on Sunday, as you're well aware. And then we want to talk a little bit about Myanmar, Burma in the context of the region and in the context of President Obama's trip to the region next month. Remember that he's going to Malaysia and the Philippines for the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Summit, and the APEC Leaders Summit, respectively. So, Ben, I'd like to thank you again for coming to CSIS and ask you to tee us off with a couple of your observations.
Sure. Well, the principal purpose of my visit to Burma was to have one last check-in, really, from the U.S. government in advance of the election. Over the course of several days, I met with the key leaders, to include President Thein Sein, the Commander-in-Chief, the head of the Election Commission, and the Minister of Home Affairs, among other government officials. Met with Aung San Suu Kyi. And then we were able to get a good report from the international monitors who will be monitoring the election, and then meeting with various elements of civil society, representatives of the ethnic groups who obviously been a part of the ceasefire process, representatives from the Rohingya community and the Rakhine Buddhist community, and then just different leading voices in Yangon. I think our key message, and I think it reflects the current situation, is that the election is a critical milestone in Burma's transition. It's not going to solve all the problems, and there are systemic problems, obviously, with respect to the way in which the politics is structured in Burma that would prevent this from being a completely free and fair election, in the sense that you have 25% of the parliament that is blocked for the military, among other issues. However, it does represent, I think, an historic moment, and one that could potentially move the country forward in this process of transition. It could also, frankly, present challenges to the process of transition. Our messages with respect to the election were, first of all, that it's very important that the government and the Election Commission continue this cooperation with international monitors, because in a situation that is so complex, it's very important that there be a credible basis of facts for the people of Burma and for the international community to make judgments about the credibility of the election. We underscored the importance of this being a credible and inclusive, transparent election, and breaking down those elements. I think the credibility comes from the inclusivity and transparency of the election. So, for instance, we made very clear that it's incumbent on the Election Commission and the government to be transparent about why decisions are being made. So, for instance, if there are delays in voting in certain parts of the country because of violence or other reasons, it has to be very clear why that's taking place, and it has to be very clear that people are going to be able to vote at a later date. As there are difficulties at polling sites that are inevitable in any election, again, there needs to be transparency about why those decisions are being made, how the issues are going to be addressed. I think that as security has been a focus around the election, It's also very important, we underscored that security not morph into intimidation of people who are going to vote. And again, we can get into more detail about the conduct of the election, but part of the message was simply it's important for there to be confidence among the people of Burma and among Burma's international partners that the election take place in a manner that is credible, that protects against intimidation or fraud, and that can yield a result that truly reflects the will of the voters. And again, that those people who don't vote know that they're going to have that opportunity in the future. I will tell you a couple of impressions. One is there's a lot of churn, there are a lot of complexity in the country right now. The one thing that is apparent is that people don't know what's going to happen, which by definition I think does reflect that there is a democratic process that is playing out in the election, albeit with all kinds of other undercurrents. There is campaigning that is taking place across the country, but there is also a fear that there is going to be intimidation or that there's going to be a failure to respect the result of the election. So there's a climate of uncertainty. We did express concern about some of the religious-based incitement that we're seeing related to the Muslim minority population in particular, that not be an element of politics in Myanmar that could risk violence or instability. But I think a point that I just kind of end on and leads into the discussion, I think it's very important for people to understand that the story does not end in any way on November 8th with the holding of the election. That what's really important, and what I left even more convinced of, is that there has to be a means for the different institutions and political factions in Burma to digest and respect the results and then determine a way that they can work together. Because a new parliament is going to be seated at the beginning of the year. A president is going to have to be chosen in March. So this is going to be a process that plays out over several months. And whatever the outcome, it will be better for Burma, for its stability, its democracy, and this process of transition. Again, if there can be agreements and understandings between the political elites of the country and the different institutions of the country, that's going to be necessary to allow for effective governance. It's going to be necessary to allow for continued national reconciliation in the aftermath of the ceasefire, and it's frankly going to be necessary to engage the international community on issues of concern like the situation in Rakhine State. So I'll stop there. I kind of hit the wave tops, but happy to go into any detail you want.
But I guess the question I have first is, I think a lot of people don't know what to expect on Sunday, and I wonder what you're telling the president and the team, back in the White House, to look for. What happens on Sunday? What happens after that? What are the milestones that you'll be looking to see whether this has gone well or we have issues to deal with?
Well, the first issue is simply what is the reporting that is accessible to us from international monitors and civil society in the country. Interestingly, that's the area where I left somewhat optimistic. You talk to these organizations with a lot of experience monitoring elections, the EU, the Carter Center, other NGOs. They're getting the access that they feel they need to the UEC. They feel like they're going to have access to polling stations. So I do think that barring some backsliding in that access, we're going to have a credible set of facts to deal from. I think you'll want to see how many polling sites are essentially prohibited from having voting going forward, and you'll want to see whether that matches up with a clear basis in fact. So it may be that there's some ethnic areas where it's just going to be too difficult to hold the election, but you'll want to be able to look at that map and see if that makes sense. Are these decisions that are being made because there are legitimate concerns about holding voting, or does this seem to try to disadvantage one faction for a political purpose? I think we'll want to evaluate whether there are wide-scale problems with the voter list. There's a lot of anxiety about this, or whether it's more isolated and understandable challenges with capacity, frankly, that any country holding an election in this stage of transition is going to have problems with. I think we'll want to evaluate what the reports are related to intimidation. There is going to be, I think, incidents somewhere in the country, right, of violence around a polling site in all likelihood. The question is, do we see that as widespread? Do we see that as having a political motivation? That's going to be a difficult judgment to make, but the more we get good factual reporting, the more we'll be able to make determinations. And then, actually, again, the monitors felt that there was a good process in place for this type of election to ensure that people's fingers are being marked, that boxes are being sealed to prevent against fraud. So I think we'll be able, again, to evaluate that going forward. I think it's going to be very hard to make some immediate judgment about the conduct of the election. So I think we'll obviously want to watch events on the day, but then I think we'll want to make sure that there's a period of time where we're able to digest the reports from international monitors, from civil society in the country. And then as we get those reports, and frankly, as results are begin to be published, I think we'll be able to make a more definitive judgment about whether we feel like this was a credible election.
I want to ask you about the White House and Burma. I mean, there's some lore out there that when the president first decided to go to Burma, I mean, that wasn't an easy political decision to make. I wondered, were you there? I mean, were you part of that decision making? And how important is Burma to the president and the White House in terms of the rebalance and your Asia policy?
Well, it's very important. I was there. It was in the lead up to his trip to Asia in 2011. We met with Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell and informed by Derek Mitchell's work. Mm-hmm. And there was a sense that there was a ripening taking place in the country, and that a U.S. opening could give momentum to some factors that were converging inside of Burma, where the military was expressing, and Thein Sein was expressing, a real desire to move in a different political direction, and Aung San Suu Kyi was expressing a real willingness to participate within that process. And frankly, that was very important to us. And before the president made very clear that he wanted to make sure that this was something that was, again, truly representative of the direction that Thein Sein was moving in, but that she was also participating. And he called her from Air Force One before he announced in Bali that he would be sending Secretary Clinton to the country. Yeah. In terms of the importance, what's interesting is Burma is at the intersection of many different elements of our foreign policy. The rebalance, I've always felt, had an enormous piece that was focused on Southeast Asia. So much of what we've tried to do with the rebalance has Southeast Asia as a hub. Yeah. ASEAN has been the hub of how we've looked at architecture in terms of initiating and participating in the East Asia Summit, which brings in, we believe, the key actors in the region to regional discussions, not just on the economy, but on political and security issues as well. The president has engaged ASEAN regularly at the head of state level. As we've shored up the alliances that are the cornerstone of U.S. involvement in the region, and obviously tended to the U.S.-China relationship, where we've really sought to build out partnerships has often been in Southeast Asia, with Indonesia, or Vietnam, and others, of course. And economically, this is an enormous and emerging market for us. So Southeast Asia was always important, and Burma was always, of course, a country that was not fulfilling its own promise in Southeast Asia. And the U.S. would benefit enormously from a vibrant, growing economic powerhouse in Southeast Asia, like the size of Burma. At the same time, we've always looked at Burma in this country through a human rights prism, right, and a democracy promotion prism. And so it's at the intersection of our support for democracy and human rights, as well as our support for relations with Southeast Asia and economic development. And then lastly, of course, it becomes yet another test case of the president's willingness to engage with previously closed regimes. Can we test whether openings can yield real results in terms of democratization and also in terms of our own strategic interests?
So fast forward to today, we're 5 days out from the election. How are you feeling about the bet that was made? I have a lot of ideas about that, but I'd love to hear from you.
Well, we feel certainly that it was the right decision to make.
Yeah.
We feel like, on the one hand, you've seen things happen in Burma that were unimaginable 6 years ago. I mean, the very fact that we're sitting here talking about a contested election, Aung San Suu Kyi's campaigning across the country, there are crowds of tens of thousands of people. There really is, political debate, political speech, political machinations in the country. And there's a lot of economic promise and desire for greater openness and engagement with the United States and the West and others. At the same time, there are endemic problems in Burma that democracy has, in some respects, opened up a space that has been challenging. So the type of religious speech I mentioned, the fact that we're sitting here talking about Buddhist extremism was not something that would have been at the top of everybody's list of predictions.
Right.
But when politics enters a public sphere, sometimes it unleashes negative forces as well as positive ones. The situation in Rakhine State has been very challenging and has required a lot of international effort just to get a minimum basis of action there. And even with the opening, I think it's easy to overstate problems because, look, this is a transition in a country that had been entirely closed. You've worked on Southeast Asia. Look at Indonesia and how long it took for democracy to get a foothold and to be represented in political outcomes. This is going to be a process. It's not going to look perfect. But what concerns us is when we see seemingly arbitrary arrests, for instance. I sat next to a woman at dinner whose husband was arrested for a Facebook post just days before. Now, what was remarkable is how resilient she was. She had been a political prisoner, and she was even able to talk about the progress that had been made in the country. But when you have that type of arbitrary arrest, even if there's open political speech and open political debate, there's still concern about when is the hammer going to fall on some person or area. So it's a mixed picture, but well worth the opening in our respect. And there's enormous promise if they can just continue to move in the right direction, recognizing it's going to take time.
In a little more than a month from now, you'll be getting on the plane, I gather, with the president and headed out to Malaysia and the Philippines. How's he thinking about this, which I guess will be his penultimate, or probably not, actually. I guess he's going to take a couple of trips. But,
we may have multiple.
Multiple trips. But
stay tuned.
How are you thinking about the November trip in any case?
Well, there's like a literal pivot to Asia that will be taking place because we're going to Turkey and then we'll be flying to the Philippines. But look, I think number one, having just gotten TPP completed and going to not just APEC, which has been kind of an umbrella for some of our TPP efforts, but also Malaysia, TPP country. We'll certainly want to be lifting up the benefits of TPP, both the economic benefits at home, but the strategic benefits in the region. Yeah. Secondly, obviously we'll be attending ASEAN and EAS, at a time when there have been focuses on maritime issues, the South China Sea territorial disputes. This has been a venue to lift up our support for obviously principles like freedom of navigation, but also discussion, dialogue between ASEAN and China on a code of conduct on peaceful resolution of disputes. That will certainly be a part of those discussions. I think we'll have a chance to see a number of important allies and partners over the course of the 2 days, but also, interestingly, we'll be with the Burmese less than 2 weeks after the election in Malaysia. And so that will be an important moment for the countries in the region, I think, to take stock of the election and its aftermath. And frankly, in all likelihood, to see Thein Sein at that summit. So it'll be all the different issues that have driven our engagement in Southeast Asia, I think, will be certainly front and center given the moment we're in.
Well, let me open the floor up. We've got a lot of expertise in this audience. I'd be happy to take some questions. Just please identify yourself and the organization that you're with. And we'll start with Priscilla here in the front.
Thank you very much. I'm Priscilla Clapp. I'm an advisor to USIP now, but I was chargé in Rangoon at one point in the ancient history. When you raise the question of religion being used in the election, in the political sphere, with the senior government officials, I don't mean Aung San Suu Kyi, but the senior government officials, what was their response? Did they respond? I don't know how they justify it because it's unconstitutional.
Yeah, well, part of our point was it's inconsistent with the Constitution, which separates religion and politics. You know, they acknowledge that there's a challenge. They kind of disavow, to some extent, you know, government sponsorship for you know, groups like the Mabetha. I think there's always this question that we wrestle with, which is to what extent is this an extension of a political strategy by elements of political parties like the USDP, and to what extent is it an organic, more natural process. Our main point was there are not antibodies to this type of activity in Myanmar. You know, that speech can cross a point to incitement, and it's not as if there's the type of checks against that behavior that might exist in other countries. In other words, if this goes into violence, the notion that there's going to be accountability for that violence, the notion that there's going to be voices speaking up for diversity and pluralism in the respective minorities. You know, that those traditions are not deeply rooted enough in their political culture that this isn't a dangerous play to make. So our message was very much to the maximum extent possible, reject that as a strategy of politics, send messages of tolerance and inclusivity. Certainly after the election, that's going to be critically important to do. Yeah, but also show some accountability when we see acts of violence against religious minorities, so that there are lines that are clearly drawn, and it's demonstrated that there's a cost for crossing those lines, consistent with the rule of law. You know, this is even more to the point that I think we can find things to criticize in the conduct of the election campaign. So I'm not suggesting that in any way we're not going to continue to raise expressions of concern about what's taking place during the campaign. But it's also critically important that after the election, there's a very demonstrable commitment from the key political elites and actors in the country to reject this path and to find a way to begin to come to some accommodations amongst themselves, but also to be more forward-leaning in rejecting both this type of potential incitement against the Muslim minority broadly, but also to address the situation in Rakhine State, which nobody has wanted to address in any way during this election season, this campaign season. So you know, you get some disavowal of the more odious behavior by the government, but our point is that there has to be more than that. There has to be actions taken to reject those forces.
A question right in the front row here.
Thank you. My name is Steve Hirsch. I'm a journalist. I realize that you won't have your analysis ready the day after the election or maybe even a week, but can you tell us, are there specific indicators that this administration is looking for to determine whether this election comes up to snuff or not? And can you share them with us, of course? And what is at stake in terms of U.S. policy for the Burmese if the election does not meet whatever the U.S. standards are? Thanks.
Yeah, well, some of this is, I touched on some of this before, but I mean, specific indicators would be, is there broad access to the vote for people, or is there denial of access to the vote that seems weighted in a political direction? So, if there are mass problems with the voter list in certain districts and not others, well, then that begins to raise questions. Again, do we see violence and intimidation on a wide scale against voters? Do we see that international monitors have the ability to have access to polling sites and to determine that the election is being conducted kind of consistent with international standards with respect to voter lists, access to vote, treatment of ballots, and guarding against voter fraud? We'll want to look, across the country and make a judgment as to whether or not, on balance, people who wanted to vote could vote, regardless of who they were or who they were more likely to support, whether their votes were properly handled, and whether the publication of results took place consistent with how elections are conducted around the world. In terms of what's at stake, I think, and we got into this with some of the non-governmental people we spoke to. I think there's almost a misperception as to the extent to which there's been a full opening of U.S. activity and economic activity. I think the government is very aware, and certainly people in the private sector are very aware, that there continues to be a chilling effect just by the fact of us having an SDN list, of us having this architecture of sanctions. This came to me a lot from a group of entrepreneurs, for instance, who suggested that they can't get access to capital because people don't want to do business and invest in Burma because they fear that they're going to be put at risk by just the mere fact of our sanctions. I actually say it's even one step further than that. It's that they're smart enough that they're doing their own risk assessments about whether Burma is a good place to invest or not, and they're looking at the conduct of this election. And so I think one of the reasons why there's been a lot of receptivity in Burma to allowing international monitors and to engaging with the international community about the election is that they know that if things go well and if the international community sees this as a step forward, that could ultimately be yet another mark on the positive side as countries are making decisions about whether to encourage investment, as businesses are making decisions about whether this is a good place to invest. So there's a lot of benefit that has not yet fully come to Burma from opening up to the United States and the rest of the world. And if they clear this hurdle well, and that's kind of the general view of not just the United States, but kind of like-minded international partners, I think it's a lot of potential benefit down the line, and people saying, okay, maybe now this is a place for us to invest. And obviously it will impact how we look at sanctions. On the military-to-military side, for instance, I think there's an acknowledgement that there's limits to things that we can do with Burma while there's this degree of political uncertainty. There'd have to be continued progress in the transition to open up space for additional military-to-military engagement. So in other words, there's a lot of potential economic benefit and strategic benefit for Burma if the election goes positively and if it is seen as a step forward in the democratic transition, and if there can be, again, as I said, some accommodation about how to build the new government in the aftermath of the election. On the other side, if it goes poorly, if the election itself is not credible, or if the result of the election is not respected, clearly it's going to make it harder for us to go forward with the type of engagement and opening that is what the incentive is for the Burmese government. So it's yet another milestone, yet another critical point where I think the Burmese are well aware that the world is watching, and if things go well, there's a lot of benefit that could come, and if things don't, a lot of what they've laid their bet on is not going to come to them because the benefit to them in opening is increased economic activity, increased engagement.
Let's go here to Japanese friend, and then we'll come back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much for today's opportunity. My name is Tatsuya Mitsumoto from GG Press, Japanese Wire Service. I want to ask about the ASEAN Defense Summit in Malaysia yesterday. Obviously, they failed to agree on anything about South China Sea issue. Do you have any reaction to the result? And then the president has invested a lot of time to Southeast Asia. Why couldn't you get strong support to freedom navigation operation from ASEAN? Thank you very much.
Well, and just to be clear on the first question, the summit of the trilateral
Defense,
summit.
the
Oh,
defense.
the defense summit. Okay,
Ash
sorry.
Carter
Yeah,
and in
yeah.
Malaysia.
So on your second question, then, I think that we were pleased with the support. We don't expect. I'll be very candid. We don't expect countries to want to necessarily wade into open oral conflict with China any more than, nor do we seek that. The goal of our operations is not to try to generate some sense of opposition to Chinese claims. The goal of our operations is simply to demonstrate that the United States is going to uphold the principle of freedom of navigation. And we think that that is a principle that is broadly welcomed in the region. What's also been very apparent to us over the years is people want the United States to be present. People want to know the United States is going to be a stabilizing force, both because of its alliance relationships and also because of its partnerships with emerging countries in ASEAN. But they also want us to have a good relationship with China. And we've had good increasing military to military contacts under this administration. So I think that our belief is that our commitment to freedom of navigation is welcomed by ASEAN. We wouldn't expect, and nor would we want, there to be for that to be an action that led to broader conflict. If anything, we want that to be a stabilizing action. And what we want and have encouraged ASEAN to do with respect to China is to pursue dialogue with respect to, again, a code of conduct and a peaceful resolution of disputes. But we're going to make clear that we're committed to freedom of navigation, and we don't think disputes should be resolved by just one country muscling another, whoever it is. And with respect to the ASEAN, and Secretary Carter's trip and his engagements with ASEAN, what a lot of that does, there's very practical cooperation that we've had with ASEAN militaries on issues related to disaster response and issues related to, regional exercises. But also, it does set up in some respect the president's engagement. Because what we try to demonstrate to ASEAN is we're engaged at a variety of different levels. We have a significant economic relationship with them. We have a significant security relationship with them. We want this to be a regular, we have an educational and energy and science and technological relationship with them. So we see this as part of a breadth of consultations with ASEAN that lets them know that we're going to be present, we're going to be a reliable partner, and we're going to be doing this at the highest levels. Again, we've seen steady growth in our defense relationships across ASEAN, and Secretary Carter's engagement is a key part of that.
Yeah, I would just back that up. I spent 2 weeks in Southeast Asia a couple weeks ago, and you're right, Ben. The Southeast Asians, to a person, privately, were all for FON operations. I was there just days before we did it, and I think every country that I visited at senior levels were saying, "Do it. When are you going to do it? You got to do it." And I think you hit it on the head. I mean, we shouldn't be expecting them to bang their chests or call it out loud. Tom, you've been very patient. Thank you. Tom Reckford here in the front.
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Malaysia-America Society and the Malaysia-America Foundation. I'd actually like to follow up on the previous question concerning the South China Sea. In terms of risk assessment, a subject you brought up earlier in a different context, China's assertiveness in the South China Sea and the various responses in the area, including by the Philippines and Vietnam, are obviously crucial, in addition to the U.S. reaction. Would you discuss the reactions of the Philippines and Vietnam, and what kind of support, directly or indirectly, the U.S. government is giving to these countries at this point?
Well, we obviously, with the Philippines, we have an alliance, which is at the core of our defense relationship. And with Vietnam, we've had an emerging security partnership. But with respect to the South China Sea, we believe it's very important that the United States not be seen as coming in to become the umpire of the claims. That what we can be is a force that is empowering rules of the road. That, as we look at the entire Asia rebalance, a lot of what that's about is the United States using our strength, our influence, and our muscle to empower rules of the road. TPP is about setting rules of the road with respect to trade. So on maritime security and the resolution of territorial disputes, we're going to lay out, here are the principles that are internationally acceptable, not just in this region, but internationally. And that is that there is freedom of navigation. That is that there has to be a mechanism for resolving disputes under international law. And that, frankly, when we see behavior that is counter to that, we're going to call it out. So the militarization of the South China Sea, or the reclamation, construction of military infrastructure by any country, is counter to that type of peaceful resolution of disputes. We're going to support international arbitration as a means of resolving disputes. We're going to support the law of the sea as a means of resolving disputes. And that's what we stand for. And that's what we're going to put, again, our strength and influence behind. And that ultimately, in these things, maybe nobody ever gets everything that they want. But there has to be a principle where, again, it's not just nations creating their own facts on the ground to try to resolve a territorial dispute, but rather being able to have mechanisms to take this to internationally accepted means of resolution. And I think that if ASEAN has been a good forum. It makes sense to us that they collectively have this discussion with China about a code of conduct to avoid escalation, just as we need to have an engagement with China on the military-to-military side to avoid any inadvertent escalation. But on the broader issues, there has to be an appreciation for norms, international norms in the region that incentivizes these, that shows that you're going to be isolated if you simply try to do this unilaterally, and that there's going to be an incentive by the region for nations to resolve these things peacefully.
Good time for one more question. I think, Alex, you had your hand up for a while.
Thank you. Alex Feldman with the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. Going back to Burma, one of the things that we keep hearing is the elections may go off, probably will go off in a coherent manner and be seen as legitimate by the international community. What the challenge has been is the voter registration lists. And I'm wondering what you heard, what your discussions were with both government and non-government actors. We know a lot of people that just are not on the registration lists and won't be able to vote.
Yeah, well, I think that I heard a lot about this. And I do believe that there is a fundamental question. There'll be problems with voter registration lists. There would be in any country, but there certainly is going to be in a country that has very little tradition of holding these elections and that is as big and complex as Burma. I do think that you should be able to get sufficient facts and reporting to determine whether the problems were ones of political will or just capability, right? That to me is a critical question. If there's just spotty problems in different parts of the country with voter registration lists, and people who have complaints about voter registration lists in different parts of the country, but you can't look at that and see a deliberate disadvantaging of certain political parties or ethnic groups. That's an acceptable lack of capability. But if it is evident that, just to take one hypothetical scenario, that there was a mass disenfranchisement of certain ethnicities because of problems with the voter registration list, or every problem was in an NLD weighted district and there were no problems in any USCP district, well, you might look at that and think, is this really an issue of capability or is it an issue of political will? And that's the type of evaluation you have to make, because it's not going to be perfect. There are going to be problems, but you should be able to look at the body of reporting and be able to make a determination about what were problems of capacity and what were problems of political design. And that to me is the critical question. You can take one more if you want.
Yeah, well, before we let you go, I've got to ask you.
Yep.
I heard you ran the half marathon in Banyan with
Luang Prabang.
Luang Prabang, okay.
Yeah.
So that was with the young Southeast Asian leaders group. Some of those guys ran with you. Could you talk about the people-to-people ties in Southeast Asia and why that's important?
Yeah. Well, let me say two things. First of all, is I went to Laos before Burma, and just so happened that they were having a half marathon while I was there. But first of all,
so you just suited up and ran it?
I just suited up and ran. I don't want to suggest the time was particularly good, but I'm alive and I'm here, so that's progress. The Laos, I went because they were going to be hosting ASEAN next year,
right.
And I think that's an important opportunity to support them as they undertake this massive endeavor. The president will be making history. No president's gone to Laos, but also there is, I think, a sense of potential in that relationship for the first time in a long time.
Agreed.
We are making good progress on the historical legacy issues, particularly UXO clearance. I think we need to do more, candidly, but we've come a long way.
Yeah.
At the same time, there really is an emerging partnership on development that hasn't existed in the past, on areas like health and nutrition and basic education. The United States is increasingly a real partner to the Lao government. And as we move past, the normalization of their trade status, I think they're looking for diverse sources of foreign investment and economic activity. And so that, combined with them hosting the summit, does give us some opening. On the people-to-people side, I can't plug enough the fact that we have this Young Leaders Program that we started in Africa, and it's been an enormous success in Africa. And we have well over 100,000 people who are in this network. Right. We have an exchange program of people who come here to the United States. And it went so well that the president said, well, let's copy this, frankly, in other parts of the world, and let's start in Southeast Asia, because like Africa, you have a significant youth bulge. You've got emerging economies and countries. And actually, some people said, well, is this going to have the same type of energy? This is kind of a new type of engagement in Southeast Asia in some respects. Yeah. And I got to tell you, it's like catching lightning in a bottle. I ran just to give you one example, I ran in this race. I was talking to one of the participants in our program after. There's a Lao from some village, and she had come to the United States. Her favorite place was Montana. She studied environmental issues and waste management, and was in Montana and Louisiana and Washington, and is now back trying to work with Lao government officials to deal with their waste management issues. They obviously have huge issues as a developing country on sewage and protecting their rivers. This person could be an important factor in development in Laos. You have people who had come here on done entrepreneurship exchanges. There's no tradition of entrepreneurship in Laos, but they're learning from other entrepreneurs and peers in the United States and other countries because of this program. And I think there's often a people-to-people seen as kind of a nice thing we do on the side. It's a lot more important than anything else we're doing, I can tell you. I mean, if the fraction of these people that we're engaging move into positions of influence in government, as entrepreneurs, in civil society, they're going to be the ones shaping the futures of their countries. And our ability to know them and to empower them is not just good for us, it's good for these countries. Why Sealy, the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, I think is something that people should not underappreciate as a means of engaging Southeast Asia. Because also, the United States is looked at through the eyes of a lot of these countries through the historical lens. In Laos, it's a very ugly historical lens. It's the bomb that you hear go off in the clearance in the district, or most tragically, that may have taken the limb of someone you know. And then when suddenly you have a different type of engagement that's about education and empowerment, that's what filters out into communities and changes perceptions of the United States. I met with people in Malaysia who studied under English language instruction in the partnership that we forged with them on English language, who said to me, I hated the United States. I thought you guys were just about drones. But then I met this teacher who helped me learn English and made me have a greater sense of myself. You can put a price tag on that. And frankly, I'd put a much higher price tag on it if I could. So thank you for asking, but I think it's going to be an important part of our engagement going forward.
Ben Rhodes, well done. Thank you very much for
Thanks.
coming to CSIS.
Yeah. Good to see you. Thanks.